So good to meet you. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Jessica. It's, of course, a great honor to be here, and I want to say thanks to Mary Fran Matson and to the faculty of the Brian Lamb School of Communication. I was told that today, unlike yesterday where I talked about the book, my new book. I've got a new book. Did you know that? Yeah, a boy has got to hustle his book. Did you know that? You just got to do that. But I was told not to talk about it today, that I was supposed to give advice to graduate students. The first thing came to mind was a poem, and I'm going to read the poem to you. It was written by the great W.H. Auden, English poet who came to the United States, became an American citizen. He was learned. He knew all the languages. He knew history. He was one learned poet. And he was invited by Harvard University to write a Phi Beta Kappa poem for a ceremony at Harvard University. And it was to take place in 1946. Does that mean anything to you in history? That's the end of World War II. And Auden, like us, should picture those veterans coming back from the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe to become freshmen at a rather regimented organization. Auden decided to address those people in a poem in the form of new commandments, like Moses. And today I shall pretend that I am a new Moses, reading the new commandments to the students. I think there's an analogy because graduate students have been treated like undergraduates for at least 4 years, right? So they've been through the wars, and now they're going to enter the true university and so on. And here is the poem by W.H. Auden. Thou shalt not do as the dean pleases. Thou shalt not write thy doctor's thesis on education. Thou shalt not worship projects, nor shalt thou or thine bow down to the administration. Thou shalt not answer questionnaires or quizzes on world affairs, nor with compliance take any test. Thou shalt not sit with statisticians, nor commit a social science. That was the best advice that I could find, and so I'm going to sit down, and that's the end of my speech, and I'm going to sit down, take a seat. Wait, I'm getting signals from the administrators that that's not enough. We have to say more than that great poem. Yeah, thou shalt not commit social science. I do remember being a graduate student at Purdue, so I can talk to you about that. Is that okay? Yeah, I can remember because I did my PhD dissertation. You can look it up. It's in the library. I saw it just the other day. You can look it up. My dissertation on a labor union, an international labor union. Why did I do that? Because I was interested in them, and because W. Charles Redding, who founded organizational communication at Purdue University back in those days, said we must not do this with a pro-management bias. You understand that? Yes, we must be analytic without favoritism, and so I did. So I was doing my dissertation, which was even recently quoted for a concept in there, semantic information distance within a hierarchy. That's a concept I came up with. But as I wrote my dissertation, I looked around at the other graduate students and I thought, Hell, we need a union. Look how we're treated. Yeah, so we did. I organized a union, and I gave them the name, the Non-Sequiturs. Do you get it? Do you know what it means? Our slogan was, we do not necessarily follow. That's a non sequitur. Yes, and okay. And as I finished my PhD, as I was finishing, Alan H. Monroe of Motivated Sequence fame was the head of the department, and he called me into his office and he said, I would like to make you an offer to stay on the faculty. I already had 2 offers in hand. I had one from Cal State University in California, and the other one was from the Chrysler Corporation in Detroit, Michigan. And the offer from Chrysler was $22,000 a year, a new car every 6 months, although it had to be a Chrysler, yeah, and free gasoline. Monroe offered me $7,200. And I accepted his offer, and I have never regretted having a life in the university. And so I moved up from graduate student to become an assistant professor. And unbeknownst to me, the non-sequiturs carried on their business and invited the great Kenneth Burke to lecture at Purdue University. He accepted, but they had no money to offer him for expenses or an honorarium. It was embarrassing. So the administration, the department, had to bail them out and provide the money for Kenneth Burke's visit to Purdue University, which was a fantastic success. Huge turnouts to hear his lectures. And I can remember one meeting in which we were with there was rather a pompous professor in the English department who was trying to make Burke look bad, and he said, well, I think you've got it wrong about Aristotle's Poetics, because he says this. And Burke very coolly said, well, you're just using the John Smith translation. Let me give it to you in Greek, and then let me give it to you in the other translations, which were much more effective. It was my job to take him over to the Union Hotel, and he would complain to me about his inability to sleep, insomnia. He even wrote poems about them and so on. But it was a great, great success thanks to the non-sequiturs. We do not necessarily follow. We do not necessarily. Okay. Now I must tell you about my first faculty meeting at Purdue University. It was not a mere, we were only a department then, but it wasn't a mere department meeting. Nor was it a college meeting. It was a full university meeting. All of the faculty of Purdue University met in one place, and that place was the Hall of Music. And they told us at that time that the Hall of Music was the largest auditorium in the world. Do we still have a Hall of Music? Is it still the largest auditorium in the world? Someone is saying no. I'm sorry to hear that. Sorry to hear that. We used to have the world's largest band and the world's largest drum. Yeah, we had a lot of world largest back in those days. Sorry we lost one of them. But, yeah, the dean of the graduate school walked out on the stage. Here we are, all the faculty from all departments of the university. And he said it was the saddest day of his career. He recognized a member of the chemistry department, which was next door to us. We were in Heaven Hall, and they were next door. And at that time, they were the largest chemistry department in the world. That's what we were told. Are they still the largest chemistry department in the world? Someone is nodding. Yes, okay. Well, the dean of the graduate school recognized someone from the chemistry department, and the person from the chemistry department introduced a motion to rescind a PhD degree. To take back a PhD degree that had been granted to a graduate student in chemistry. You know that old saying, there's one thing they can't take away from you? Yeah. This was a serious moment. They presented the evidence. The person had written a dissertation that was so important that the research professor directing the project had other graduate students get onto and try to build upon his findings. They couldn't do it. They couldn't build on it. Then he said, well, I guess we're going to have to replicate it. So the graduate students went back into the lab and replicated his study exactly the way he did it, and guess what? They got very different results. Very different results. The person had moved on from Purdue to the University of Chicago with a postdoctoral fellowship to continue his research, and had recently accepted a position at the University of Iowa. When Purdue got in touch with him, he declined to comment on this, but they found out that he quickly made a phone call to the registrar trying to get a copy of his transcript. Yes. Further research indicated that, well, you know, in chemistry, at the end of the day, the researchers take their chemicals to a lab analyst, and the lab analyst analyzes these things and then certifies what's in. This person had forged every one of the lab analyst's slips. And they admitted in the chemistry department that his work, his dissertation, took a great deal more creativity than it would be to report the results of his data. But he instead created this complete fiction. Well, they said, well, this has only happened. The physics department was furious, by the way, with the chemistry department. They thought they were not doing their job. And some people said, well, this could only happen in chemistry or physics, but did you know that in a recent issue of Science Journal, 60 significant experimental studies in psychology were replicated, and they did not get the same results? Someone has offered an explanation in a letter, in an article in the New York Times. This story is what Aristotle called an enthymeme, in which the audience participates in the construction of the argument. You must reach your own conclusions about this study, but I had moved on from Purdue University to Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. But I still had a good friend here, Bruce Kendall. He had been my master's thesis advisor at the University of Nebraska. And when I came to Purdue, he applied for a job here and came here, and you give an award in his name too, don't you? For graduate students. We'll come back to that award, why. But I stopped to see Bruce here in West Lafayette, and he sat me down, put on some classical music, and handed me a book to read and said, read this. I had seen this book before. I had heard about it because it was a runaway bestseller and a critically acclaimed book written by a man named Truman Capote, and the title of the book was In Cold Blood. And I sat and read the whole book in one sitting and said, he says this is a new literary genre. This is a new category of literature he's created. a nonfiction novel. He has used his novelist gifts as a writer to present the facts of a multiple murder in Kansas, the Clutter family, in Holdridge, Kansas. There was a character in the book that I knew, and that character didn't seem to be like the person I knew. So what I decided to do was to take a lesson from the chemistry case, and I decided to replicate Truman Capote's research. I got in my car in Detroit, Michigan on a cold and snowy day and drove all of the way to Kansas. I interviewed all of the survivors. I read all of the back issues of the newspapers. I interviewed the reporters who'd covered the case. I talked to the prosecuting attorney, who looks like a complete idiot in the book because he wouldn't sign the agreement. Asked me if I forget about the agreement, what the agreement was, okay? I talked to all I got a copy of Perry Smith's confession and compared it to the confession in the book. Completely different. I went to Topeka, Kansas and got the transcript of the trial of Smith and Hickok. Took it all back home to Detroit, and it wound up being published after an awful lot of work by Esquire magazine, and I still have a copy of the check. I forgot to bring it along. It was in the June issue of 1966 of Esquire, and they paid me $650 for it. And it has been reprinted several times in literary anthologies of literary criticism, and every time Esquire sent me the money that they extracted from that. Yeah. Well, a couple of other things that are interesting about that is that I made a trip back. Well, I was on a radio station, the biggest radio station in Detroit. I had 15 minutes of fame. I was in the New York Times because that book was so important and he was so important yeah. So I was invited to be on the big talk show on radio in Detroit, and they asked me all the questions, fired away and so on, and I answered everything. At the end, the producer said, "I am a good friend of Truman Capote's. He's a good friend of mine. Would you be willing to debate him on the radio about this?" And I said, "Yes, I'm ready." Truman Capote, like the chemistry student, declined to comment, declined to debate, although he did some very ugly things to me after that. There's another enthymeme, I guess, about replication and the importance of it. David Burke used to be the head of communication department here, was then an editor for the Quarterly Journal of Speech, an academic journal. He asked me for an essay about it, about this whole project, and I wrote it, and he didn't give me a dime. $650 from Esquire, not a cent from the Quarterly Journal of Speech. But he did offer me a job, and to offer my wife a job in 1980, and we came back to Purdue, and well, it's been great. And it's been even greater to come back this time. Now, I've got some more suggestions for graduate students, and here they come. And they're going to be one at a time, and you've got to etch these on your cortex. You've got to make notes and remember, etch them on your cortex because they're so important. How to read. I'm going to teach you how to read. Okay? You ready to learn how to read? I thought I was a really good reader. I scored high in the verbal tests and so on. I came to Purdue. I was taking 3 graduate hours in graduate hours of statistics, 2 courses in economics, 2 courses in sociology in addition to all my communication theory and rhetorical theory and so on and so forth. And as I read things, I would write notes. My notes were bigger than the original source. When I went to class with my notes, they'd bring up an idea, and by the time I find them, the discussion was over. I was absolutely overwhelmed, and somewhere I found a booklet. And I wish I could give you the citation, but listen very carefully because it made all the difference. Trust me that it works. This booklet said that when you're reading serious material, like academic material, you open the book to read either an article or a chapter. You read that chapter, then you close that book and you make an outline of the key notes on a piece of paper. Then you open the book and go through there and compare your notes with what's in the book and make the corrections if necessary. You got it? Yeah? I did this. Read the next chapter, did the same thing. I got better each time I did it. I got to the point where I didn't have to write it down. All I had to do was pause, review the major points. They were up there. And later in my communication theory course with Professor Redding, I learned what I was doing. I was taking that little instant of time to transfer the material from the short-term memory into the long-term memory. I didn't have to refer to my notes in class. Bring up any topic you want, Professor, and I'm ready to talk to you about it. And it was a great relief. I still do it today. If something is important to me, I close it, I close the chapter, or close the article, the book on it, and yeah. Recently, I was having lunch with 2 brand new assistant professors in Denver, and I said, what kind of advice would you give to your graduate students at Purdue University? And they said, both of them said, learn how to write. Learn how to write. And one of them said, I worked with George Cheney. He was my advisor at Utah. And I wrote something for me, and he came in and sat down with me and frowned and said, Brendan, I want you to try to do this. When you're writing something, try to keep in mind the fact that somebody else will have to read it. It was so bad. So I'm going to give you some tips. I'm going to give you some tips about writing, okay? Because I'm also a professor of comparative literature, and I've studied literature and biographies of great writers and so on, like Ernest Hemingway. Shall I begin with Ernest Hemingway? How did Ernest Hemingway write? Well, when he was living in Cuba, for example, he would get up in the morning, and he would go and he would stand up and write. Standing up. I've been doing this, reading and writing lately, and it is very good for one's back. I recommend it. He would write for about 2 hours. You know, he is one of our greatest short story writers and novelists. He'd write for a couple of hours there in Cuba, where he lived, and then he would stop. When would he stop? He would stop knowing word for word the next paragraph that was going to come. That's in his head, time to quit. I've got that next paragraph. He would go to the post office, pick up his mail, go to the bar where they invented daiquiris for him. He would drink a few daiquiris and read his mail. Then he would drop into the house of ill repute. Then he would go get his yacht, take his yacht out, and catch some fish to bring home for the evening meal. Get up in the next morning, and guess what happens? That first paragraph is there. He starts writing it, and as Kenneth Burke told us, one act motivates another act. The act of flowing, writing, that one paragraph, the juices, yes. And so, no writer's block. I've used this ever since I discovered this. Try it. Will you try it? Some people are nodding vigorously. Wonderful. Put your trust in me about this next one, because I've not seen it in print. But a friend of mine, a trusted friend at Carnegie Mellon University, told me about it. Carnegie Mellon Mellon University is a rather technical university, but they emphasize the ability to write for all their students. You've got to learn to write. And they have evaluated them, and they know how well they write. And they decided to do an experiment. They got into one room, the very best writers in the university and the very worst writers. Best and the worst. You walk up and down the aisle and watch. The best and the worst. You want to know what difference they saw? Who wants to know? Yeah, okay, a few hands are going up. The best writers could be seen starting a sentence and pausing, frowning, scratching it out, starting over with another sentence and writing it. On the other side of the aisle, these students could be seen starting a sentence, pausing, frowning, adding a new dependent clause, and then another one, and so on, and then trying to make sense out of that, and kept going until the sentence gets longer and longer, and so on, and then moves on to the next paragraph. Do you understand? Yeah. I believe in this. I believe in this. In fact, now, I do it like this, without even actually putting the pen down. I can see the words, in a sense, that I'm writing. And is this going to work? And I try, nope, it's not. Start over again. But try it by beginning, actually. And if it doesn't work, cross it out. Next suggestion. Are you taking notes? The next suggestion is, thou shalt not commit a social science. Now, why do you think W.H. Auden wrote that as one of the commandments? Because in my experience in universities, that social scientists had the reputation of being the worst writers on campus. They were trying to achieve an objectivity as if no human being had written this. There are statistics, and there's no reference to human beings other than the subjects that might have been used in the study, and so on. It's completely, and it's not accessible. Things are not defined. And I have a reputation, folks, for using first person singular in a lot of stuff I write. My current book, it is. Yeah. And I once sent an article to the Quarterly Journal of Speech, and they said, we've not ever published an article using the first person. And I said, well, my only defense is a quotation from Henry David Thoreau, who said, it is always the first person speaking or writing, whether we acknowledge it or not. And they did publish the article. Prospectus. I saw a big bulletin board this morning. Prospectus. You're going to like this. When you face a prospectus, and in fact, I'm going to ask you to start writing prospectuses for everything. Or do you say prospecti? I'm not sure. Let's say prospectuses. Okay. My editor, Kelly Kim, is nodding. Yes, okay. We're going to go that way. I got this idea from Carl Weick, and people in organizational studies will probably recognize Carl Weick's name as a social psychologist who wrote, and he's very much aware of communication and so on. He said, Carl Weick said, for a prospectus, always write in the future perfect tense. You know what future perfect tense is? A lot of people don't. And a lot of people won't admit they don't know what a future perfect tense is. Perfect means I will have perfected, I will have completed. And so you write the prospectus in this way, by the time I complete my thesis, I will have gathered the data in the following ways, I will have analyzed the data in the following ways, and will have reached conclusions. Do you understand? Now, I found that this worked so well for my own work and for that of students that I used it in undergraduate classes, and I would ask the undergraduate students to give me a one-page prospectus for their term papers. And I can't tell you how many times I found problems that we corrected, that they had forgotten about, had overlooked in their writing in the future perfect tense. And we fixed them up, and their papers were better. Here's a quickie suggestion. Get any edition whatsoever of Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. Anybody know that book, The Artist's Way? Anybody? I see one hand. There's another hand back there. Whose hand is that? Doesn't matter. Julia Cameron was a big-time screenplay writer in Hollywood. I mean, she wrote screenplays for the biggest producers and directors in Hollywood. And she wrote a short little book called The Artist's Way, with beautiful quotations in the margin from great artists. And in it, she tells you how to write. The Artist's Way of Writing. I have a former student from the University of Colorado who is now in Hollywood trying to break into the screenwriting business, and he says Julia Cameron today is thought by screenwriters to be more important for The Artist's Way than for all of the screenplays that she wrote put together. They've all done it. And one of the things Julia Cameron makes you do is to get up in the morning, and you may as well stand up like Ernest Hemingway did, and write 3 pages called morning pages. And there has to be an agreement with everyone in your family and everyone you know. No one else will ever read these notes. They are only to you. You therefore achieve a kind of honesty with yourself that you might not otherwise do. I know that in writing my book about homelessness in 2009, I used passages from my morning pages because they allowed me to reflect at a deeper level on the things I was seeing and so on. 3 pages, 3 honest reflection upon it. This discipline is incredible. Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way. Yes. Last night I had dinner with it was a wonderful, wonderful dinner. And there were 2 experts on writing from the Purdue University Press. And their first names are Catherine and Kelly. And I asked them for suggestions. Any writing suggestions? 4. Write out of it. Listen to these. Write them down. Number 1, learn to do the proper citation, please. They have to deal with this all the time with book manuscript. Learn it now as a graduate student. APA, whatever it is, you learn how to do the proper citation. Number 2, understanding copyrights, your rights and limitations as an author. Number 3, learn how to get permissions to quote. It's a lot easier than it used to be in old days, isn't it? But it's still important. And 4th, listen to this one. Learn to write in an accessible writing style. Accessible writing style. I see a few nods around. What does it mean? Somebody tell me what it means, accessible.
Simple, transparent.
People can what?
Simple, transparent. People can grasp it.
You can read it and understand it? Yeah, okay. You're not trying to baffle. Huh? Yeah, it's accessible. And learn to make the most difficult, complex ideas you're dealing with accessible to the reader. You've got to slow down and work hard on that. I thought those were terrific suggestions. Here's one more. William Allen White was an important publisher an editor of the Emporia Gazette in Emporia, Kansas, and this was the most important Republican progressive newspaper in the country for many years. And he was a terrific writer and teacher of writing, and he had a rule. Listen very carefully. What did I say? Listen very carefully. He thought that the word very was very much overused. Very is very much overused. You shouldn't be laughing. You should be amused by this, because I'm using the word very to I mean, you try your best, Mary Fran. You work and you work and you do your best. But so what is his suggestion? Whenever you're writing something for someone else that has to go, that's going to be read by other people, instead of when you start to write very, stop. And instead write damn or some other curse word. You got it? Right, put that curse word in there. Use the damn things, and that will have to come out. That will have to come out. That's all I'm going to say about writing, but keep those in mind, will you? And try them. Give them a try. Give them a chance. For those of you who want to become professors, and Jessica assures me some of you do want to go on to become professors, I want you to know that as professor, teaching must come first. Teaching must come first. You have a Bruce Kendall Award for Excellence in Teaching to graduate students here in the School of Communication, and I probably knew Bruce Kendall better than anyone else because I'd known him at Nebraska, I knew him here, and we spent time socially and so on, and he believed that teaching should be considered a calling as if you were in the ministry or in medicine. You understand what I'm saying? That it was a calling. It comes first. In addition to that, you had to maintain noble and high professional standards. And you also had to be cultured. You had to know something about classical music. You had to know something about literature and the arts to help students and to understand students. A professor, that was how important it was. If you stopped to see him, stopped over at his house, he was a lifelong bachelor. If you stopped over at his house, you might just have a drink and then play Drop the Needle. He had the biggest collection of vinyl records I had ever seen. And I would put a record on, drop the needle at random. Choose a record at random, drop the needle, and count to 10. He had to give me the composer, the work, and the orchestra, and so on, and record album, if he could, and so on. And he started doing it to me as well, to test me. Yes, it must come first. However, number two, I want you to be demanding as teachers, but also I want you to be flexible. I was single when I was at Kent State University. I was a professor of communication by then when it happened. Do you remember what happened at Kent State University? Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, they have a song about it, don't they? What's the name of the song? 4 Dead in Ohio. 4 Dead in Ohio. Yes, the National Guard came on campus about a protest, shot 4, wounded 9 others. Killed 4, wounded 9 others. This person sitting up here was an instructor during those days. And I was teaching a class in communication theory, and one of the students came up to me and said, "Phil, may I give you a term paper without words?" And I said, "John, I've never had a term paper without words. What in the world do you have in mind?" And he said, "I was on the quad one day, and I had my camera, and I took some photographs. And I think I can arrange them in a paper that will tell a story about communication. National Guard, students meeting, grenade, yeah, well. I said, I've never had one, go ahead. John gave me the term paper. I gave it an A+, and he sent the paper, his term paper from my class, to his hometown newspaper, and they submitted it to a competition, and John P. Philo that year won the Pulitzer Prize for photography. The famous photograph of the young woman with their hands up, and all of the photos leading up and following that one. He also gave, Elaine Anderson was her name then, she and I wrote a book about Kent State. He allowed us to use those photographs, and some publisher in England has just decided next year to reissue that book. It'll be a new edition of Communication Crisis at Kent State, a case study, with my undergraduate students' term paper. He came to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and also photographed our wedding as a wedding present. Yeah. We think as teachers we always have to begin with the abstract and move to the concrete, don't we? You got to begin with a few definitions, a few theories, and things like that, and we'll get to some examples later on. Yeah, we'll do that. My son is a firefighter, U.S. Forest Service. And in 1992 he gave me a book, the title of which is Young Men and Fire. I was so taken by this book, this tragic case of fire. One of the first groups of hotshots landed on a fire at Man Gulch in Montana. A fire exploded. They tried to run uphill. The fire caught them and killed them all. The author, John McLean, was a Shakespearean scholar at the University of Chicago who grew up in Montana and knew about it, and he wrote this beautiful book. I said, this book is the way to begin a class in organizational community. Began the seminar. Give them the book, read it, and then write a paper about how those lives could have been saved. How could we have improved the risk and safety of those people? And they wrote papers, and they were crappy. Terrible terrible papers. I threw them away. And I said, now we're going to get into the theory and research and organizational communication. They got into it, they ate it up because they saw a concrete thing to apply it to, started writing papers to me, and some of them were getting them published before they turned them into me. Convention papers. A professor here at Purdue it became the fire seminar, and a professor here at Purdue University taught the fire seminar. The fire seminar is taught today at the University of Montana, where is the Center of Firefighting Research and so on, education. And the McLean family, the author has passed away, but the McLean family invites the seminar up to the family's cottages and lakes, and they celebrate his life and the book. His son has since written other books. There is a chapter about it in my current book, Firefighting with Smart Risk. Read it. Read it. Okay. In that chapter, by the way, it predicts that because of mismanagement by the Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Forest Service at the top, the bureaucrats in Washington, that a conflagration is on the way. And this book was written a couple of years ago, and it appeared last summer as if the conflagration had already reached here. California, Oregon, Washington, remember the fires? Yeah, it's going to come. Okay. Professors must know the history of their discipline. You have got to take a course in rhetorical theory and know that why rhetoric or communication was the first academic discipline in ancient Greece. Because they were experimenting with democracy, right? And the people had to be able to speak out. They had to make arguments. They had to be able to refute the arguments of other people. You've got to know that history because it is extremely important. Germany, one of the most educated countries in the world, had no history of a popular rhetoric, popular courses in public speaking and so on. And look how they were taken in by Adolf Hitler and his propaganda. Yeah, you've got to know the history of rhetorical theory, the history of your discipline. It's very important. Now, Jessica said some of you are going to go into consulting. First suggestion I have for those of you going into consulting, you've got to read a book called The Management Myth, Why the Experts Keep Getting It Wrong. Now, it's on page, there's a full citation, page 249 in my book, footnote 10. Check it out. It's written by Matthew Stewart. I don't think he's any relation to Charlie Stewart and Jane Stewart, but the author was an ABD in philosophy, all but dissertation. He ran out of money, had to go to work. He applied for and got a job at a consulting company. And they taught him what to do. They taught him things to sell to companies that they didn't need. He tells the truth and he names names. You want to read that book before you go into consulting. You promise? Yeah, okay. The Management Myth. Do not sell a product until you have analyzed the problem it's supposed to solve. In other words, there must be a need step before a satisfaction step. We had a signing in Denver for my new book, and 4 people from fire departments showed up and bought 7 copies of the book, and they've been after me ever since, and I've been working with them. They wanted me to help them implement the recommendations in the book, but I insist on finding out whether or not I think it's going to work. I'm going to interview the people out there on the line as well as everybody else before I agree to really try to sell it. The final point. The final point of advice for you, and it's advice for everyone in this room. Everyone. Citizen, professor, student, whatever you are. It's for you. It's a study that I report in chapter 3, I believe it is. Instead of just citing a whole bunch of studies, I get some really important studies and look at them closely. Very closely. And one of them I look at is one of the biggest studies I have ever seen anywhere. And it is important for you to note that it was written by 3 people. Did you hear me? It was written by 3 people. Yeah. Okay. And what did these 3 people do? They studied 20 million academic journal articles. 20 million academic journal articles over a 50-year period. 5 decades of science, engineering, social science, arts, humanities, all of the disciplines, and it doesn't matter. You understand what they did? They're looking at these studies. And guess what they found? Just with counting, doing a little counting. And I'm quoting from them. Teams increasingly dominate sole authors in the production of knowledge. Shall I repeat that? Yeah. Teams, I'm quoting, teams increasingly dominate sole authors in the production of knowledge. If I were a graduate student right now, it's not just quantity. Yeah, it's not just quantity of those being published, it's also quality. And how can they measure that? By the citation index. The number of times an article is cited by somebody else, that goes up with team authorship as well. If I were a graduate student or a young professor at this point, I would begin to look for teammates. Who can supply something to help me? Who can add to the complexity of my thinking about a problem, my methods of working on the problem, and so on. Yeah. And the whole argument, I'm not supposed to talk about my book, but the whole argument about the book is that, do you believe we're living in a time of increasing complexity? Anybody who disagrees with me? I'll fight it out with you later. How about risk? Is risk? Yes. Yeah, I talk about the German sociologist who said you live in the risk society today, created by big science and big government and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's there. How do we answer? How do we solve it? How do we deal with it? With complexity and risk? Teamwork. It's what I first discovered in NASA when we went to the moon. The problems we could not solve, teams had to attack with different skills and knowledge bases and so on. Yeah. And and it's also to try to encourage people who teach communication, organizational communication, who write about it and teach about it, to make their theories and teach, to take into account complexity and risk. Risk not only, if you look in the dictionary, the risk will be defined for organizations as financial risk. Not to the workers, not to the customers, not to society in general. When I first started writing this book, I was using the GM ignition problem, and I said 12 people have been killed already. Each time we had to revise it, and Kelly Kim, the editor, said, Phil, we're not going to be able to use a number because it keeps increasing. Last time I heard it's over 100 people killed, and we know that there was an email within the organization in which an employee knew about the problem with the ignition system in those cars. We've all got to be concerned about it. And finally, I'm going to share, is this finally? Not quite. No, not quite finally. But there was an unexpected finding in the book that I think professors ought to know and graduate students ought to know too, and that is the power and the importance of analogic thinking. If you read the book, you will discover that a Harvard professor of medicine and surgery discovered a new way to increase the safety and effectiveness of surgery by visiting the Boeing Aircraft Company and high-rise construction, to find the team-generated checklist that is now used. The World Health Organization did a study in 10 countries, one in Africa, one in India, and all over the place, and then trained them in the use of the checklist, which reduced the hierarchical distance between the surgeon and the nurses. And now the nurses can say, oh, wait a minute, you're supposed to put the antibiotics in before you make the incision. And so when they do it as a team, deaths dropped significantly. Infections dropped significantly all over the world. It really works. And this man's ability, throughout the book I have examples of people who were could find analogies in other organizations and industries. So you can't concentrate on one industry because you might be missing out on the analogical solution to the biggest risk and complexity that you have. Yeah. I said we had a signing in Denver and these firefighters came up and so on, and we've been talking a few times, and one of them said, we'll need a second edition of the book, and we'll have to have a chapter about us. And so we'll see about that. But after the book came out, and I want the visual aid to come up right now. After the book came out, and this is a reason why I would like to do a second edition of the book, to include a summary of this work. The title of the book is Team of Teams, and the author is General Stanley McChrystal. Now, anybody I talk to about teamwork and open communication will say, well, what about the military? Well, what about the military? Well, General McChrystal fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he started out with the command model of trying to fight insurgents in Afghanistan and Iraq. Did it work? No, it did not work. That's the old style military organization chart. So they said, we're going to have to use teamwork. We're going to have to organize our military men, our fighters, into teams. And that's the second one, the command of teams. Did that work? No, because the teams weren't in communication with each other, and so they had to go down finally to the team of teams. This is a decorated and respected general of the U.S. Army, who is recommending a team of teams, even for the military, to handle complexity and risk. And now you're going to hear my conclusion. You're going to hear it, and here it comes. This week has been the greatest honor of my life, and I want to thank very much everybody here at Purdue for making it that, the greatest honor of my life. And I want to say thanks to the Purdue of the past as well. People who are no longer with us, yes, W.C. Redding, yes, of course, N.B. Beck, Robert Eichhorn in sociology, who taught me so much. And the people today, Mary Fran Matson and the other, Charles Watkinson, who was the director of the Purdue University Press. He was tough but fair. And when I started to make a book proposal, he said, do not include the fact that you were a student here, or a professor, or associate dean, or that you were on the editorial board of the Purdue University Press. I want the board to make the decision on the basis of the quality of the proposal, not any of that old school stuff, and so I did. I had to take that all out. He was tough, and everybody else, Catherine Purple and Brian Schaefer and Kelly Kim, wonderful to work with. Yeah, wonderful. So as another way of expressing my gratitude to Purdue, in addition to those important people of the past and the present, I've made a couple of decisions. And one of them is I have made a cash donation to the W.C. Redding Fund here in the Lamb School of Communication. And today I announce, and we've worked with the financial people this morning, today I announce that I will share the royalties from managing risk and complexity with the Brian Lamb School of Communication, 50-50, as long as I live. Thank you.